mass prison expansion, the United States has come to be the world leader in incarceration. If you compare the U.S. to other industrialized nations, we lock up our citizens at 5 to 10 times the rate of Canada, Western Europe, and other nations do. And regardless of what you may think are causes of mass incarceration, some think it's societal and poverty and oppression, some think it's individual misbehavior. Regardless of what one might think, there's something fundamentally wrong when the wealthiest society in the world also has the largest prison system. This is a very bad statement. I think we all know that incarceration doesn't cut across the population equally. These are figures from the Justice Department going back to 2001. Trends at that time show that if those trends continued, 1 of every 3 black males born in 2001 could expect to go to prison at some point in his lifetime, 1 of every 6 Latino males, 1 of every 17 white males. And we're not just talking about spending a night in a local jail. This is going to a state or federal prison for a year or more. So 1 of 3 black males, 1 of 6 Latino males. The figures for women are lower overall, but we see very similar racial, ethnic disparities there as well. One other thing that we've seen through mass incarceration, we all learned it, I think, after the Ferguson tragedies, if we didn't know it already, is that among the many sort of ripple effects of mass incarceration, the federal government has been providing surplus military hardware to local police departments all around the country, and this has caused a lot of the escalation of conflict. But it turns out it goes further than that too in terms of where they put their hardware. This next slide, you're going to think I made it up, but it's actually an article from the Los Angeles Times. So here's the headline. LA schools police will return grenade launchers but keep rifles and armored vehicles. So the LA schools were able to apply for this military hardware. I wasn't in the room when this happened, but presumably they had the superintendent and the Board of Education and some other administrators, and somebody probably said, hey, we can get a grenade launcher from the federal government. And apparently there was nobody in the room who thought that was a bad idea because they got their grenade launcher. You know, I'm sure they have some bad kids in the Los Angeles schools who are difficult to discipline, but, you know, I think in the 21st century we've learned that, you know, you have to be a little measured in how we do things and all that, but this is pretty bizarre, right? So let me just keep our, well, that's all right, we'll let that. So anyway, that's the brief overview of mass incarceration. So the reason we have mass incarceration are complex, but fundamentally it comes down to 2 different factors. One is we're sending more people to prison, and secondly, we're keeping them there for longer periods of time. We keep them for longer periods of time because of policies like mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out, cutbacks and parole, all kinds of things like that. We've collectively around the country in the last 20 years or so, there has been a good movement to try to develop alternatives to incarceration, to divert people charged with drug offenses or have substance abuse problems into treatment programs rather than prison. Most communities have courts where people can do community service and make restitution for lower level offenses and the like. So we need to do more, but there's been a good deal of work done. There's been much less done on the back end, how much time people are spending in prison, which has grown longer and longer over these last several decades, which leads to the research in the book that my colleague Ashley Nellis and I have written called The Meaning of Life, the Case for Abolishing Life Prison Sentences. What we find is that today, 1 of every 7 people in prison is serving a life sentence. 1 of every 7. So it's 206,000 people are serving a life sentence. To put some perspective on that, this is a greater number of people serving life than the entire prison population in 1970. That's the scale. If you look internationally, make comparisons, the United States compared to the United Kingdom, we have about 5 times the population of the UK. We have 1,000 times as many people serving life without parole. This is something of the scale of what goes on here. Now, most of the people serving a life sentence have committed very serious crimes. There are some people who are in prison for their 3rd drug offense, serving life without parole, and that's just horrendous. But most people have committed murder or armed robbery, serious crimes like that. So why should we care about this? Well, I think there are a number of reasons that have to do both with public safety, with compassion, with what kind of society we're trying to build. For a start, there's a growing movement to challenge mass incarceration. Lots of organizations are saying we should start with a 50% reduction in the prison population. Most people in prison, contrary to what you sometimes hear, are not locked up for a drug offense. About half the people in state prisons are there because they committed a violent offense. So if we want to end mass incarceration, it's not a question of legalizing drugs or diverting people away. All that may be a useful thing to do, but it's not going to end mass incarceration. Life imprisonment also escalates the punishment for other crimes as well. Punishments are proportional. So if you have the death penalty and life imprisonment at the top, it means that even for crimes like burglary and car theft, people in the United States spend much more time in prison than they do in comparable nations. The public safety issues of life imprisonment is sort of counterintuitive, but life imprisonment actually produces diminishing returns for public safety. And the main reason why that's the case is because the one thing we know about involvement in crime is that people age out of the high crime rate years. Anybody who has kids knows that when young boys and young girls alike turn 14, 15, 16, they start to do things that we're not pleased with very much. And if you look at arrest rates and the like, they really spike pretty high in the late teens and early 20s, but then they start to come down very sharply by the late 20s, 30s, certainly by the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Basically, people grow up. They get jobs, they go to college, they have families, they have more responsibility in the community, so people grow out of those prime years. So the 25-year-old convicted of armed robbery who gets a 50-year sentence in prison, by the time he's 30, 35, 40, in most cases is much less of a public safety risk than that 25-year-old was. And what happens then is that each successive year in prison, we're getting less and less public safety benefit, and it comes at increasing financial cost, in large part because as people age in prison, just the outside, healthcare costs go up with them too. So we're getting less and less public safety over time. We're also diverting resources too. So we have a 60-year-old serving a life sentence, and you can see prisons in Louisiana, Pennsylvania, elsewhere, where they have geriatric wings of prisons, where people in wheelchairs and the like. We're spending enormous resource on those people when the 14, 15, 16-year-olds, where we could do something with a constructive intervention, we could have an impact on public safety there. What we call for as an alternative is that we should establish a maximum prison sentence of 20 years in prison, except in unusual circumstances. Now, this sounds somewhat provocative in many ways, but if we were in Western Europe today, this would not be at all provocative. Either by statute or in practice, it's very unusual to serve more time than that in prison. We've sort of lost all sense of what the scale of that could be. And yes, there will be some people who are still a threat to public safety after 20 years, and we can develop means of identifying who they are and how we should deal with that. but we do want to look at other ways of doing things. Let me just close with a quick story, just to give a feel for things. I've been going in and out of prisons for many years. I started doing this work in Michigan and spent a lot of time with lifers at Jackson Prison. And one of the guys I'd come to know pretty well, I was visiting there one day, and he asked me if I could get him the address of the organization Save the Children, which, helps children around the world. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. Why do you want it? And he said, well, he'd been locked up for many years. He had a job in the kitchen in the prison, and he earned a few dollars a day. And at the end of the month, after he'd spent some money in the commissary and all, he had a little bit left over, so he wanted to send $5 a month to Save the Children. And he said basically, he's never had a chance, either when he was convicted in court or in the prison, at least in some small way, to try to make amends for the harm that he had caused. This is what he wanted to do. So we're very good at punishing people, but we're not very good at giving them opportunities to change, to recognize that change, and think about what it means about preventing crime as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Now we're going to have time for questions. So just some ground rules. We're just asking that we keep it down to at least one question or one comment, not a combination of both, not a follow-up, because we want to make certain that we have opportunity for everyone to speak. You can come back up again, but just after other folks have had an opportunity to ask their questions. Before we move into that, I just want to do two quick acknowledgements. First, we have our delegate from District 20, Janelle Wilkins, here. I told her she didn't have to speak, but I wanted to acknowledge that she's here. And also, once again, we have Sandy Bartlett here, who did come down here from Laurel. She's in District 32, and she's our new delegate in the state of Maryland. Okay, question time. So there's a microphone in the center of the room. You can jump up, form and stand in line, or pop up out of your seat and just ask your question.
Sure.
Yes, the time limit's now. So we're just asking 9 seconds, which I feel is generous. So, and I will have two of my gatekeepers in the front who will be keeping track of the time, just so you don't go over. One of them is pregnant, and we'll exploit that if we have to.
Hi, my name is Bob Goulden, and I have sort of a question, a curiosity question about how it works when people apply for jobs these days. Does everybody get asked whether they have any criminal background? Have you ever been arrested? I mean, I applied for a lot of jobs during my time in the workforce, and sometimes it didn't come up, and a couple of times I lied about it, and that's one. Why don't people just lie about it more?
Bob, is that your question? Well, to give you the landscape of how it works in Maryland now, just this past session, Delegate Nick Mosby led the Ban the Box for private employers here in Maryland, and it passed out of the Maryland General Assembly. So we're waiting on it to be signed by the governor. But if it is signed, we'll be the 13th state in the country to have that type of legislation. And particularly that bill would allow for the question to not be asked on applications, and it wouldn't be asked until after the first interview. And the whole point is to give folks the opportunity to be themselves and present themselves without having the stigma of their criminal record being the first thing that glares out on their application. Also, there are several jurisdictions that already had a ban the box type of legislation. Montgomery County already had one. You guys already have everything, but Montgomery County already had one. Prince George's County had some form of one, and Baltimore City had the strongest existing ban the box type of legislation at the city level. So currently in Maryland, well, after this bill is signed, hopefully it's signed by the governor, that question won't exist, whether you're a public entity, like so if it's a state application or a private employer. Because the whole point is, like you said, we don't want people to feel like they have to lie. We know that it's a deterrent just to have that question. And ultimately, either you just don't apply for the job, you lie, and then ultimately that has its own ramifications on the back end. And so that's what we're trying to get at. But Ban the Box is just one tool when it comes to dealing with criminal records in the workforce. And so I think it's a front end application of what we can do, but there are so many other things that can happen, and happy to talk to you about those later.
And wouldn't it be better if our systems were designed such that I receive training and skills during incarceration, that I have an opportunity to connect and meet with employers who would employ me, that there were incentives in place for an employer who would hire a formerly incarcerated individual, whether it be tax breaks or subsidized employment opportunities, so that it doesn't really matter if I have a record or not. I have skills that I have learned, I have certificates that I have earned, and there are employers who are supportive and ready to hire me.
My name is Holly Sarakis, and I work with the Immigration Committee in Takoma, Mob, and so there's a lot of intersection in terms of immigration work and criminal justice work. Marc, when you were talking, I was just thinking that as a society, we've bought into incarceration, that it's now a big economic piece of our state and our economy. And someone else pointed out that 4 people in Ohio are employed in the state prison system. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on what that would mean in terms of changing public policy to de-incentivize building more prisons, to kind of release us and build a different economic model.
Well, the hardest part of it in many ways, a number of states are starting to reform their policies and consciously trying to reduce their prison population. And a handful have had pretty decent success. One of the real problems in those states and others is that so many of the prisons built in the last several decades are built in rural areas of the state. The reason is, land is cheaper up there and things like that. And these are rural areas that, have very little going on in terms of economic opportunity. So it's not necessarily a great economic opportunity to have a prison. There are actually a lot of drawbacks to it, but if the prison population goes down in the state and the state says, okay, we don't need as many prisons anymore, we're going to close this one, and this one, they get tremendous resistance from the people working at the prisons and from the town, where there's ripple economic effects too. So it's, what we need to be doing is trying to work to reduce the number of people in prison, close some of the prisons, but also work with those communities to say, how can we develop a more wholesome, constructive form of economic opportunity for people like you. And the irony is our prisons get filled disproportionately by Black and brown people from low-income neighborhoods and urban areas with little economic opportunity, and then they go upstate to rural communities with little economic opportunity, and one community is sort of profiting, if you want to think of it that way, off the other. But this is no way to run a decent society.
This question is for any of you, or possibly for Delegate Wilkins. When it comes to bothering our legislators about bills that we support, is it better to email or is it better to phone?
I'm always an advocate of do everything that you can.
So both?
but I think it just depends. It depends on the issue. It depends on what your goal is. So I would say if you're wanting to have a more substantive conversation with your legislator, then it's always best, I personally think, to maybe email, especially during the interim, because then you have the opportunity to set up time to meet with them. They have like an inbox with a staffer that goes through, checks the emails, and that's their dedicated job, is to make sure you have the opportunity to sit down and be with your legislator, versus if you're just trying to, sometimes we just want people to call to create chaos or paranoia or show that this is a huge issue, and so we just want to bug them. And so sometimes calls are better, because it's a constant ringing of the phones, and that shows the legislators like, I gotta do something about this, especially during session. Sometimes that's just what you need. So it just really depends on what your goal is by that reach out of contact, I would say.
I'm Jane Harmon, Film Park. Maryland uses a lot of solitary confinement in their prisons. And a lot of you may have read a recent editorial in the Washington Post by the Cook County jail, whatever, official. They have eliminated solitary confinement. And I think it's time for Maryland to work on that. It does so much damage to prisoners. And it's used as a crutch when they don't have enough staff people. They don't want to take the time and trouble. But I've gathered a few names already of people who want to work on this, if anyone else does. And I think the ACLU has some model legislation, and perhaps that's something we can introduce next session. Yeah, I don't think it's ever gotten very far, but if someone knows the status.
I serve in the judiciary, so this came right into our committee. We are a relatively new committee. Most of us are new. And so our ideology and our save the world aspect hasn't been tarnished yet. So we have spoken repeatedly about ending restrictive housing. There were some bills that were put in place and that did pass with respect to restrictive housing for our youth, restrictive housing for our pregnant women, and mental, yes. And so here's the thing. Emily Shetty, who is in District 18, okay, yeah. So Emily is, I know, wants to end restrictive housing. I know that's something that she is passionate about. So she probably will be putting in a bill. So I think we would work with her, but I would co-sponsor it, and I know a lot of people on judiciary will co-sponsor it as well.
Great. And we have Will in the Senate, and I think
We have Will in the Senate.
We really didn't coordinate this, but I'm going to follow up on what they both said. I'm Jean Katz. I'm from Takoma Park. I'm very involved here in District 20. I'm also active in the Maryland News for Justice Reform, and went to Annapolis to lobby on behalf of the three bills that she's talking about. What we need, one thing that we're lacking, because we have lives and other things to do. We're already, the races, we got it. There's no more convincing. It's like, what do we do in Maryland? And so some of these things, one was, they were restricting housing for pregnant prisoners just because they were pregnant, and then they were isolated and nobody came and saw them, and they didn't have, there's a lot with each one of them. One of them that directly affects Ms. McGency, I hope I'm pronouncing McGency, has to do with reentry, because one of the bills was to stop the direct release of prisoners from a long time in solitary with no preparation. That's happening in our state. And I can't imagine you lock somebody in solitary and then, oh, your sentence is out, bye-bye. That was wrong. There's a lot of different things. What I found interesting in lobbying is the allies that you think are going to be your allies are not necessarily your allies. Here in District 20 in Montgomery County, we're good. But in the Senate side, the one who was keeping it from being brought up, didn't want to hear about it, was nasty at people that came and lobbied, was a Democrat, the chair of the Democrat from Baltimore County. So, and the union, the biggest opponents of changing a lot of the restrictions on solitary confinement, or the guards union. Now, we don't know, I mean, they're very underpaid, et cetera, we all know that, and I don't want to take up the whole evening talking about that, but each thing, it's like the devil's in the details. So getting the information of where the pressure points need to be mean that we can work on those things. It's like we're sold.
This question is for Marc. So I work as a federal public defender, and I've been doing it long enough now that I've, had the opportunity to actually see individual clients who've spent a good chunk of their growing up time in prison and been able to kind of see their transformation. And then, I have a client now who's serving a 65-year sentence, and I'm now representing him in a habeas case, so 20 years in, and so I can see how he's changed from the person, who committed the crimes he did 20 years ago. And one of the interesting consequences of the sentencing reform that has happened is that we've had lots of resentencings in front of federal judges where they bring people back. And the judges are always so touched and amazed and surprised by seeing these stories and seeing these stories of transformation. And so I guess I wonder what we can do as members of the community and what you're doing, what other people can do to bring these stories to actually, obviously like the humanity, I have a different sense of the humanity of my clients than a lot of politicians do, but that particular, the face of these mostly men who have been spending their lives in prison.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That's what we try to do as much as we can at the Sensei Project. We're known as a research and policy organization, but we also recognize how important it is to tell the stories. Just as Willie Horton told one story that was, just crass and just awful, but very effective. We need to tell stories as well. It's not a plug for my book, which is for sale over there, but I will tell you what we did there. When you're talking about life imprisonment, as I mentioned, these are people largely convicted of murder, robberies, sex offenses, and others. If we just talk about them by the crime that they've been committed, very few people are going to be very sympathetic. So we recognize the need to tell the stories. So a colleague who would serve 27 years at Angola Prison, Louisiana, one of the worst, on a life sentence and got out, was a prison journalist. So we worked with him and he wrote up a half dozen stories of people inside serving life or had gotten out or family members, and we sort of interspersed those stories in the book. So we try to make the argument on public policy grounds and evidence, but it's the humanity that that's going to reach people, I think, in the first place. So, yes.
Good evening. Derek Frost. I'm with Takoma Park Mobilization. Just as it seems like this is part of a much bigger problem, right? So just like, the whole militarization of U.S. society, right, and the wars that are waged are connected in part to, the military-industrial complex and profit-making companies, and we're a society with tons of guns. I wondered if you could comment on the role of private companies in running the prisons, and how much of an obstacle to reform is the recent privatization of a lot of incarceration. Thank you.
I'm going to sound like I'm a conservative now. A lot of people think that mass incarceration came about because of private prison companies and the like. Just for the record, I think private prisons are a terrible idea for a million different reasons. It's not the driving force that's given us mass incarceration. As terrible as they are, only about 8% of people in prison today are in a private prison. Now, it's not trivial. That's 120,000 people or so. But private prisons really took off in the mid-1980s when the wars on crime, wars on drugs were already in place. And I think rather than creating that legislation, they were there to profit off of it. Once it became clear states and the federal government wanted to build more prisons, they said, we'll be happy to do it for you. And they claimed they can do it cheaper, which is not true. And they claimed to be more effective, which is not true. And the like. So it is a problem. It's, among many of them, the private prison operators don't care where prisoners come from. You know, typically if, you know, you're convicted of a crime in Maryland, you're gonna be to prison in Maryland. But they'll have contracts with states anywhere. So for a number of years now, the state of Hawaii has had a very overcrowded prison system. So any given moment, they have hundreds of people in a private prison in Arizona and they were convicted in Hawaii. So you just think about what does that mean for family visits, or if you have a legal case pending, meeting with your attorney, you know, just exacerbates all the problems that we typically have with prisons too.
I'm Peter Jones, and I just have a quick question. I'm not sure if anybody wants to answer it or deal with it. But you mentioned the Speaker of the House, you know, coming up is the race happening. In terms of criminal justice reform, is there one candidate that's better than the other?
Well, to be frank, I think the candidates that are currently up for Speaker of the House, they were both previously members of leadership, and members of leadership vote the same. So there isn't going to be a voting record that shows you that there is one candidate that is better than the other. I do know that Delegate Maggie McIntosh recently released a policy platform that included a focus on criminal justice. And so that hasn't happened before, but again, that hasn't happened before because we haven't been in this space to actually ask these questions and develop something like that when it comes to the Speaker race. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there's one that's better than the other, because outside of the fact that one has made a very clear point to invest in dealing with criminal justice issues, but based off of voting record, which I think is the most important, because that's what you have to look at someone's ideology over time. There isn't a particular candidate that has been better than the other. They both have had the same level of investment when it comes to their individual voting record. But I can say that there have been some that have been stronger leaders on some of our issues, for JOTF in particular. Delegate McIntosh has led the ban on asking the criminal record question on college applications, which passed in 2017. But there was a veto override in 2018. And also she's the chair of appropriations and has appropriated for the funding for pretrial services since the bill passed in 2018. So it was $1 million last year, $800,000 this year. But again, I wouldn't say that that is necessarily like you can use that to denote that one is more invested in the other. Our organization is based in Baltimore City. Delegate McIntosh is a delegate in Baltimore City. So a lot of the issues that we have that deal with criminal justice are, for some reason, even though there's crime everywhere, tends to be focused on Baltimore City. So there are so many things that go into it. And I wouldn't use criminal justice as the litmus test for how you choose a speaker, simply because there just hasn't been a long track record in Maryland of an investment in criminal justice for us to even let that be the determining factor. However, I do think that is important for those who do feel that that is something that we should invest in moving forward, to make that a central point for whoever becomes the speaker. But I think that true test actually will come after a speaker is chosen, because at that point you can put in accountability measures and you can hold whoever is the speaker accountable when it comes to particular issues that come through the Maryland General Assembly, if that answers your question.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. My name is Ezio Borcini. I'm a Maryland attorney. Just a quick question and a comment. There was a bill in previous years. Maryland is one of 3 states where the governor has veto power over awards of release from the parole board. Is that bill coming up again? Did it come up this year? Why didn't it come up? Is it going to come up next year?
That's the taking the governor out of parole bill that you're asking for. So that's ACLU's bill. They did it last year, and they brought it again. I think they brought it again this year. It's a very controversial issue, and every year the same proponents come forward and the same opponents come forward. And I think that if we are wanting to see any movement on that bill, then there has got to be a strong effort from the community to let it be known that that is a priority, especially since that we will have some new leadership
I'm
coming.
surprised that it's controversial. I mean, we're only one of 3 states, and the parole board hardly lets anybody out anyway. And so taking the power of the governor away just to say no doesn't seem to be too controversial. But I see your point, and I thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, just to add on to that, you're absolutely right. It's a two-pronged problem. First, that the parole board, rarely lets people out. Just a couple of months ago, there's at the men's prison of Jessup has a lifers group, people serving life sentences, and they have meetings and bring people in. So they invited me to come and meet with them. So we get there, and there's about 30 guys in the room, and the leader said, well, everybody can go around and introduce themselves and say how long you've been here and how many times you've been to the parole board. So every one of them had been locked up for more than 30 years. They had had between 2 and 6 denials by the parole board. And what you see in the parole board, I'm sure you know, and others, typically parole board members will deny you parole if you're a lifer because of the severity of the crime that you committed. And these people did commit serious crimes, but that's why they got a life sentence 30 years ago from the judge. What the parole board is supposed to do is to say, who are you today, not who were you 30 years ago. So, huge numbers of them get turned down by the parole board, and the few that get a recommendation, then we get the second obstacle of the governor. And, no governor, Democrat or Republican, usually wants to give up that power. So that's why we need to build much more of a movement.
And just I wanted to make a quick comment on the salaries of, somebody mentioned that the people who work in prisons aren't paid very much. I just finished spending 2 years working as an appointed attorney at the Montgomery County Detention Center, and a lot of the guards, you can actually look it up online, are working 2 and 3 double shifts, pushing about $200,000 a year. So they're not really hurting. And the ones that aren't making very low wages. So my comment on that. So. Well, I can say for a fact that I know some guards that are making almost $200,000 by working overtime.
Thank you. Question primarily for Ms. Thompson. You mentioned pretrial services. I'm aware of pretrial as a time of vulnerability, but I wasn't exactly sure what those were and why I should be eager for them.
For pretrial services?
Yeah.
So just to, I guess, provide the context. So when Maryland moved away, de-incentivized using cash bail, what happened is while we did have an increase in those who were released on their own recognizance, which means they're able to just go about their business, and then they are charged with bringing themselves back to court to make sure that they follow through with what's needed. There was also an increase of folks that were just held without bond. And a lot of those were second-degree assault cases. And second-degree assault in Maryland can be very, very egregious, but it can also be something very simple. Like this can be second-degree assault in Maryland. So when you have those types of cases, for those who kind of fall in the middle, judges are often put in a very odd space of having to make the determination of whether someone can be released, but they want some type of community supervision option. But when you don't have pretrial services, which is basically just community supervision options, then you're forced to hold an individual without bond, even if it's something as simple as a simple second-degree assault. And so that's why it's important to make sure that every jurisdiction has the ability to have some type of pretrial services. Because if you're an individual who is arrested here in Maryland, here in Montgomery County, where they have lots of pretrial services, you are obviously more likely to be released with some type of community supervision because the judge just has more options at their disposal to give you. Versus like Calvert County, where they don't have pretrial services, you are more likely to be held without bond, which means you're going to be detained. And we know that when you are detained, you're more likely to be found guilty when you actually get to your court date. And you can be detained for a long period of time when you aren't given that ability to have community release.
Thanks, that makes a lot of sense.
My first question is for Stephanie. I really want to hear from you in terms of how you were able to create coalition to develop your best practices for reentry, and describing that process of coordinating with other folks who may not have been on the same side of your opinion or perspective, and how you were able to come to consensus to develop those plans for reentry. No.
So I was working with a group of people who are very diverse. So very far right leaning groups, very far left leaning groups, folks left of center, right of center, etc. At the beginning and end of the day, the group came together around the fact that something needs to be done, probably a sentiment that most of you in this room feel, and that not a lot of attention is placed on what happens to folks during incarceration, and not enough attention focused on the warm handoff from when they are incarcerated and then when they come back to the community. So we invited people to come together for about a year and a half and essentially dream big. Remove the constraints of cost and time and politics, and say, at the end of the day, what do people need to return home most effectively? And in that discussion or as a part of those discussions, came a number of very concrete recommendations. And what's happening now, I think, is a growing interest across all sectors. So very far right-leaning groups who may have in their mind that a primary reason to think about reentry differently is to reduce the cost of the system in the first place, and far left-leaning groups who may be motivated more by civil liberties and civil rights. It doesn't really matter what side of the argument that you are on. There are roughly 600,000 to 700,000 people here in Maryland, a little over 9,000 coming home every year. And what we need are focused conversations across multiple systems about what needs to be done. And I just want to tell a quick story to illustrate. I was talking with a group of formerly incarcerated women in Washington, D.C., talking about their experience. One of the women was a teacher, and whatever crime it was that she committed, she would not be able to retain her teacher's license when she was released. So she went in with a plan, that there were all these courses and certifications and the like that she could receive when she was incarcerated. And she had planned it out. She was going to serve 5 years, and when I get out, I'll have all these things done. And when she got to the correctional facility, the waiting list for all of those courses was ridiculously long. And she was only able to learn how to do two things during her 5-year period of incarceration: how to crochet and how to knit. So if we think about reentry and incarceration as a time of learning, a time of rebuilding, a time of rethinking what you want to do with your life, and yet we have very few resources available for people to do that when they're inside, and then they return home to obstacles in Maryland with fewer resources available to them. My mother works in probation and parole here in Maryland, and she says, quite frankly, those who are adjudicated in DC have a much better chance of doing better when they return home than those who are adjudicated here in the state of Maryland. If we think about our investment in what happens during that time as not a political issue, it's not a good, bad, or ugly. It is what kind of support needs to be offered to make sure that when people come home, they are better coming home than they were going in. And we have an investment in making sure that that's the case.
My second question is for Nikki. I want you to talk about this Johns Hopkins public safety bill that seemed to kind of go in at the last couple of weeks during session, and just the impact of that and what we're going to have to do once it's implemented. So there was a bill this past session to allow for Johns Hopkins, which is a private institution, higher education institution in Baltimore City, to have a privatized police force. And so the impetus for concern for advocates, especially a student-led group of folks, students who were on Johns Hopkins University campus, was the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency that comes into play when you have a privatized police force. And so dealing with Baltimore City and the current state of policing in Baltimore City, it also just seemed to a lot of folks who were advocates against the bill and opposition of the bill, this was just not the right time to be allowing for Johns Hopkins University to have a privatized police force. And so this issue actually came up in the prior legislative session and then spilled over into this legislative session, which is not odd. A lot of bills do, because again, we only have 90 days. But it became very contentious because, for just optics wise, it looked as if you had this huge higher education entity that is very well resourced, very well funded, going against these grassroots organizations and students who were very, very adamant about not wanting to have a privatized police force. And ultimately, the bill did pass, but there was a strong effort from Baltimore City to, in effect, kill the bill because, number one, their biggest concerns was that there obviously wasn't enough accountability. There was an accountability board, I think, that was authorized through the bill, but there was no one from the community that was going to be on that accountability board. There was also concerns about language that allowed for, if you were in this privatized police force, you were able to pursue folks outside of the university's, I guess the realms of the university, if there was hot pursuit, which meant that if you were chasing someone into the community, you were able to go into that community. And then also just a lack of transparency. So when the Johns Hopkins currently had BPD officers, Baltimore City Police Department officers, that were surveying the area, and they don't have police powers, but they do have the ability to provide some type of enforcement, but that also made them subject to the transparency that is required because they are a state entity. But when you have a privatized police force, that is not there. And so dealing with just the concerns around corruption in policing, especially in Baltimore City, the legislators from that jurisdiction, specifically Senator Mary Washington, Senator Joe Carter, Delegate Nick Mosby, Delegate Stephanie Smith, were strongly opposed to this bill. And I said ultimately it passed, and right now the students that were opposed to this bill have been in a 23-day sit-in at Johns Hopkins University, still protesting the implementation of this legislation, and we will just be looking to see how the implementation takes place. There's also been talks of entities filing lawsuits against Johns Hopkins to prevent the implementation of this privatized police force. So again, we will just have to look and see. But it was an opportunity, I think, for us to see how community voice is so important. Because even though the legislation passed, the fact that these students were able to show up to Annapolis and just provide so much, I think, courage and encouragement for the legislators who were opposed to the bill to be strong in their opposition, I thought, for me personally, it was extremely inspiring to see them and to see how every voice is important, no matter how young, no matter how old. And I mean, a 23-day sit-in is nothing to bat your eye at. So that's where the legislation currently stands.
Interesting, the question, email versus calls, and frankly, mass movements in the community. I just wanted to thank Shayla, the Mass Incarceration Committee, and frankly, the audience for great questions.
How you doing? My name is Andres, and I have a question for any of you. We've talked about you talked about the high volume of incarcerations in the States. My question goes to how much prevention are we doing as a country or a state, in drugs, flowing in the streets, and arms. Someone mentioned they're flowing everywhere. It's very easy to get guns, and the lack of opportunities. When you put those three together, crime is going to skyrocket. So what are we doing as a country and as a state to prevent incarceration from the future?
Well, it's a complicated question. So mass incarceration started in the 1970s, and that's when we started to build prisons, and it really took off in the 80s and 90s. And there was a problem of rising crime in the early 70s. It started from the early 60s to early 70s. A lot of that was just because of the baby boom generation coming of age. All of a sudden you had a bunch of young males in the population, and all things being equal, that contributed to more crime. So suppose you have a crime problem, what do you want to do about it? Well, there's about 28 different things you can do, right? So we want to start, and how do we support families? How do we strengthen communities through schooling, through parenting skills, through economic opportunity, whole range of things, and also the criminal justice system. But essentially the decision that was made, no, it wasn't necessarily consciously said this way, was the way we're going to deal with this is by building prisons. We're not going to do all of those other things. And I think the reason that we said that was going to be the decision was because the face of the crime problem, as you saw on TV and elsewhere, it was typically a young black male. Whether or not that was entirely accurate about the crime problem wasn't the issue, but that was the perception that the public had, that policymakers had, and the like. So very quickly, the answer became punishment then. Many people pointed out, difference between the crack cocaine epidemic and now the opioid epidemic. And, in the 1980s, Congress quickly passed these harsh mandatory sentencing laws that sent hundreds of thousands of people for crack offenses, overwhelmingly African American. The opioid crisis tends to be more white working class communities, and yes, some of those are going to prison, but there's much more of a discussion about public health, prevention, treatment, and I think the distinction is just the racial perceptions that we have.
So the first was the correlation between race or ethnicity and criminal justice. So it's always it seemed like there was demodification of African Americans, and it's sort of, you saw it with Jim Crow. So that's in terms of, have we reached a critical mass to transition out of that with the opioid crisis and so on and so forth. The second thing was, is there a cheat sheet for sensational stories that you can go ahead and share, like the LA County sort of related launchers scenario, which is, that's one of the things that's good for traction. So for all.
Well, in terms of stories, I like our website very much. It's sentencingproject.org. The ACLU, the Drug Policy Alliance, is an organization called FAMM, F-A-M-M, which started as Families Against Mandatory Minimums. They have good stories, case histories, and the like. So I think there's quite a bit out there that illustrate the problem and some solutions and personal stories as well.
And I would add that there are several documentary films that you can all see. One is called The Sentence. There's a Netflix series, I think it's Netflix, called Released, that follows multiple people through their journey being released from jail and prison. And the Vera Institute of Justice has a very powerful webumentary, as they're calling it, for their Reimagining Prisons project. And it catalogs not just only, it has the data and sort of explains the history of incarceration, but also tells some very powerful stories of individuals who have been involved in the criminal justice system.
To go back to your first question about race and the criminal justice system and just how it relates to Maryland. Maryland, even though it is steadily decreasing their prison population, still has one of the highest racial disproportionalities in the state. So whereas black people make up about 28% of the state population, they're over 70% of the prison population still. So even though I think most recently the numbers show about a 30%, is it 30% decline in the prison system, the disparities still exist. And so it's really about addressing the drivers of the disparities and how folks are kind of put into this system, because that is where you start cutting at some of the racial disparities.
My name is Maurice, and I wonder, with the extremely tight labor market that we have now, does this give us some opportunities to maybe get some more training for people in prisons, so that, so more interested in, you were mentioning that,
negotiating something that everything had a waiting list, but maybe there's more, maybe there could be more pressure from employers, say, to get more training people so that they can be ready to fill the jobs that are more available these days.
There are a number of things that are inhibiting some of the job training programs and just educational resources and the like inside of jails and prisons today, especially in prisons. One is just a lack of space. With prison overcrowding, space that had been set aside for educational programming and the like is now being used to actually house people instead of having that space available. But there's some amazing things that are happening in some parts of the country where incarcerated individuals are earning college degrees. They're learning skills and trades and obtaining certifications during incarceration. And some of that has been driven by a demand from the states in which they live and the business industries in those communities. And from legislative officials, elected officials who are willing to take the risk to suggest that this is something that actually should be done and is a really good investment for the resources that they have available to them. One other thing about that, especially as it relates to a difference between men and women, there are many more services available for incarcerated men than there are for incarcerated women, very specifically. And there's also a disconnect in some places between services that are made available for quote-unquote non-violent offenders versus violent offenders. And one of the things I think we have to start to consider is eventually most folks who are incarcerated will be released. And even the violent offender should be receiving services and supports. And what we need is a more measured and intentional review of how each individual person's time is spent and an assessment of what each individual needs when they enter into a jail or prison and a definitive plan to meet those needs before they are released. And some folks may not need all things. And like the example that I gave of this woman, she had a plan and was unable to meet it. Wouldn't it be lovely if someone had asked her what her plan was and then actually helped her work through it during her period of incarceration?
Let me just add one thing in terms of, specific policies that need to be changed, and then there's some opportunity. Back in 1994, Bill Clinton got through a major crime bill through Congress, and it was $30 billion worth of funding loaded with money for building prisons and policing, and very little for prevention. And one of the provisions in that was to eliminate the use of Pell Grants in prison for people in prison to be able to take college courses, which used to be a fairly common thing to do. Typically a community college that was near a prison would offer courses and people in prison could access Pell Grants. So in a mean-spirited moment, they took that away, which decimated higher education prisons. There's now momentum for trying to bring that back. In the Obama administration, they were able to get through a kind of experimental program. So they have some money over a 5-year period. It's much less than there used to be, but they're able to do some of that. But there's beginning to be some bipartisan support to overturn that ban on Pell Grants, which, if you really cared about public safety, that is like the stupidest idea you could possibly have, right? More education makes for better citizens, better opportunities, and the like. So it's, I'm sure Jamie Raskin's not a hard sell on this, but, we do need to build a strong movement and let people know that this is something we need to do.
And at the state level, just some reforms that have been championed in terms of better connecting workforce and employment skills with those who are reentering. Actually, Delegate Janelle Wilkins has been a very strong advocate for correctional education and then providing data that we need from inside so that we know how to better connect folks when they're leaving. She passed the bill HB 78 that JOTF has supported for the last 2 years to even allow for that data to be available because, as you mentioned, allowing for system collaboration from inside to outside, we need to know what's inside in order